So this is a strange one, and this is probably going to be a long video. The Red Spectacles is a movie from straight out of left field, a movie that I really enjoyed watching and have a huge, huge admiration for. You'll see it's going to take a lot of energy to unpack all the crazy things that happen in this movie and all the big ideas behind and underneath the surface. But even if we set aside all the quirks and tricks and the ideas, I think this is a remarkably complete movie, even though it's really unconventional. One of the most unconventional movies you can find. It has everything you could possibly want. Action, emotion, nostalgia, romance, humor, tons of humor, playfulness. Extremely playful movie with highs and lows. Like I said, a really weird movie, but it has it all. I'm going to talk about a lot of theoretical stuff here. Hopefully this video will make sense. But I think one thing that's important to say is that this is a surprisingly accessible movie. Even if nothing I'm going to say here makes any sense, even if it doesn't feel like super deep or something like that, as long as you go into this movie expecting a strange, fun, off-the-wall experience, I think you could really enjoy it. So this is a movie that I can't recommend highly enough, and a movie that I'm proud to have on the channel. Absolutely a gem. The Red Spectacles. Happy to share it with you. It's rated 6.5 on IMDb with 749 votes. You know how it goes. What a phenomenal movie. Like I said, this is a weird movie, and it's also a very dense movie. This is not a one-trick pony. There are a lot of different ideas at play. Not everything in the movie is totally unprecedented, but there is so much going on. This review isn't going to be anywhere near comprehensive, not even close. None of my videos are comprehensive. They're just my feelings on a day. But here we're going to have to leave aside huge portions of this movie to have any hope of finishing the video. Before we really get started, I think it's also worth noting that there are two other movies that will really help to understand this one. The first one is Branded to Kill by Seijun Suzuki, and the second one is Alphaville by Jean-Luc Godard. Unfortunately, both of these movies are also very complicated, so I'm not going to try explaining them here just to get some hints about this one. But if you've seen those two movies, you are very well situated for this one. And if you've seen those two movies and you haven't seen this one, go watch it. I'll try to get some of the reasons, some of the similarities across. Maybe you also chuck in just a little pinch of Terminator 2 to this movie as well. That's, Terminator. Let me also say that this movie is directed by Mamoru Oshii, who directed the animated film Ghost in the Shell, the anime film. And this movie is part of something called the Kerberos series, which includes some manga, and the anime Jinro, the Wolf Brigade, which is quite well known. This review is not going to have anything to do with fandom. I haven't seen any of his other films. I haven't read any of the comics. I don't really care about them, to be honest. Nothing against them, but this is just a review of this movie, not of some world, not of some fandom, not of characters, anything like that. Okay, let's get to the actual content. The majority of this film has a neo-noir style, black and white, with trench coats, Dutch angles, the whole 9 yards. But the movie actually starts in bright color. The movie actually starts with a lot of explanatory text telling us about the rise and fall of the Kerberos Brigade, which was once an elite branch of the police force in Japan. This is in the movie, not in real life, to be clear. Made up of individuals with superior intelligence and superior senses of justice. The brigade was outfitted with powerful weapons, protect gear, like animatronic skeleton suits or whatever, body armor, basically. RoboCop. RoboCop, actually, interesting movie to think about as a parallel to this one. Anyway, Kerberos Brigade was outfitted with the best and unleashed against the criminal underworld. But the severity of their methods was inevitably controversial. The brigade was disbanded, and this movie opens up with the last three members on the run. Koichi, Suichiro, and Midori. Now, I say all this not because the plot of this movie is particularly compelling or cool or anything, but because this description is a huge signpost for some of the ideas of the movie. It's convenient that they give you, it's a pretty good signpost in the opening little explanation. Now, it's not quite something you should take literally, but Before we get to that, let's talk about what actually happens in the first section of the movie. This is in color, like I said, and it opens with these 3 cops kitted out in their cyborg body armor, superhuman look, but they're also wounded and dripping in some sort of glorious sacrifice. They're in this warehouse, part of some industrial zeitgeist, and they're confronted by a bunch of mercenaries. They're on the run. You hear radio announcements going out offering a reward for capturing them, and no sooner has that happened than a horde of mercenaries show up, and the 3 cops have to fight them off. This all has quite a 1980s tint to it, and this is why I mentioned the Terminator or whatever. That's one thing that this has that like Branded to Kill and Alphaville don't really have, is it's sort of a more 80s updates in some way. Terminator would have been one of the most salient sci-fi sort of tropes at the time, or sort of things. We don't really get to see what kind of movie this is going to be, though, until the violence starts. Because when the violence starts, it becomes clear that this isn't exactly going to be some run-of-the-mill action movie. It's hard to put your finger on what it means for a movie to be deconstructionist, but the violence here is a great example. Most action movies stylize violence. They make it slick, set it to music. Think of the fight scenes in something like Kingsman. This movie is the opposite, really. The violence is edited strangely. It's jarring. We get a bunch of different angles spliced together in a way that doesn't really make sense. No spatial coherence at all. A lot of really tight shots. And we've also we go in between sort of a bunch of slow motion shots all the time as well. It's also interesting that the guys, these mercenaries that they're fighting against, are all costumed the same way. They all look a bit like a character you might find in a Mario game. Kind of interesting. There's a number of things here that we aren't really smoothing over. This is not slick stylized, or maybe it's stylized so far that it sort of loops back around or something. That said, it's not totally in your face, and really there is often a fine line between movies that are over the top and movies that I would say are deconstructionist, right? It's hard to put your finger on what that means. And yeah, maybe a movie is just campy, or maybe a movie is insightful and incisive or something like that. Well, they're not mutually exclusive, but it can be blurry. Thinking about Seijun Suzuki for a second, he spent a lot of his career making normal Yakuza films, more or less. But as the years went by, he kept turning the dial a little bit more and more, started making these movies more over the top, weirder, and by the end, he made some truly bizarre stuff. It can be a bit of a continuum. So you might watch this movie and think it just seems normal, or it just seems a bit old. And I think that in this opening section, it turns the dials a little bit past normal, but not all the way, right? Not quite to 11. And the purpose probably to bring out a bit of artifice and to reveal a little bit of the skeleton of movies like The Terminator. Why does it do this? Well, I think the opening section of the film is kind of a foil for just about everything else in the movie. The Kerberos Brigade, named presumably after Cerberus, for those who might not know, character in Greek mythology, the guardian of the underworld, or something like that. I've never really been into mythology. But a dog with a lot of heads that kept the dead in the underworld. Seems like a pretty tough job in some ways, keeping the dead in the underworld. But in some senses, it's pretty straightforward. It's pretty easy to know who belongs there and who doesn't. The police likening their elite squadron to this evokes a sort of non-controversial arbitration of justice. The squad are the good guys. They have, remember, heightened intelligence and moral sensibilities. So they are always able to separate the good and the bad, the living and the dead. It's non-controversial arbitration of justice. And this might also remind us of something like The Terminator, or a lot of crime film from all kinds of eras, countries, and genres. Non-controversial arbitration of justice. The opening text already gives us a bit of a hint that this didn't work out, and the rest of the movie is going to show us a totally opposite view of the world, where justice is almost impossible to discern. Maybe it doesn't exist, where simple values like trust are eroded, and where traditional values, family, even basics of sustenance, have been scooped out, it seems, and are almost disintegrated. This is all a picture of the collapse or the impossibility of old world values. So yeah, this movie is a movie about postmodernism. Hate to break it to you. And there is a profound ambivalence here. So I'm trying to be a little bit even-handed as to whether or not the future is so much a disaster or a new opportunity. Anyway, in the beginning, we're treated to the old days in this movie, the days of simple morality, where right and wrong stare each other down across a border. It turns out that only Koichi can escape this standoff. The other two are wounded and await their fate in the warehouse. Koichi promises to come back, but then the opening credits roll. And we're introduced, by the way, to a great soundtrack. Music is extremely 80s, but really cool. And even though it's this 80s action score, there is something a bit melancholy to it as well, which is maybe par for the course with a lot of Japanese pop music of the era. Phenomenal music throughout, though. Phenomenal. During the credits, we also get more intro stuff telling us what happened to Midori and Suichiro, who were both apprehended, it turns out. And we also learn that this all takes place in the distant future of the late 90s. So check that off your sci-fi bingo, Days of Future Past. Now, after the opening credits, we jump 3 years into the future when the world has become black and white. The first shot after the credits shows us the top of a lighting tower, like you might see at a stadium, lighting up the field, or at a prison, lighting up the fence, or at an airport, lighting up the runway. And indeed, we're at an airport. We don't need to make too much out of every single frame here, but with one static shot, we're already being clued into some pretty interesting ideas. Surveillance, artificial light, a liminal space, a certain type of infrastructure that is going to dominate the rest of the film. The next shot is sort of a reverse shot. We won't be going shot by shot through the movie, don't worry. Don't really have time for that. But honestly, you could, because there's so many interesting images throughout this movie. Almost any technique you could wish for is in this movie, even a whip pan, I think. Anyway, here we see Koichi in a trench coat and sunglasses, the noir aesthetic, and he's at the airport, the ultimate liminal space in a way. Shout out to the beginning of Playtime, by the way. Airport is liminal space again. Even though Koichi is outside, we hear the announcements from inside the airport asking people to proceed to various gates. These announcements are in English, very interesting detail. We get some kind of weird cuts. We're going to keep hearing these announcements, by the way, the airport stuff, throughout the whole movie. We never quite leave the airport in some ways. We get some weird cuts, we get some weird angles, and before too long, Koichi is going to be riding in a glass elevator, a people mover that has a huge poster of a face in it. This is the city. Now, this movie gives us a somewhat different portrayal of a city than many movies about postmodernism, or even many movies about modernism. Usually, cities are crowded. The hustle, and the bustle is one of the defining characteristics. The incomprehensible collision of everything in the world, the continuous circulation of everything you could ever hope to see. It's all there in the city, but in the red spectacles, the city is mostly empty. I think we can probably read this as Koichi's lonely internal life, having left his friends behind and having come back to a place that isn't quite what he remembered. The empty streets kind of resonate with noir stuff, a detective shuffling along a city, but being fundamentally alone with his masculinity, I guess, his footsteps echoing down at the street. Now, if you didn't get the hint that this was going to be a weird movie earlier, then you really might get thrown for a loop here. This part of the movie looks extremely cool, but the plot is a bit abstract. In the interest of not making this video 10 years long, I'm going to try and skip ahead a little bit. I just want to note a couple of interesting things. First, the movie behaves a bit like a silent film for a while. I don't mean just that there is no speech, but the way it's filmed and also kind of the logic of the story have a bit of a silent era feel to them. This movie is going to shift around a lot stylistically, sometimes subtly, sometimes very noticeably. I'm not sure I can think of another movie that that has so many kind of absurd and bizarre jumps in style. One of the few movies that I can even think of that's as off the wall as this is the really cool movie Funeral Parade of Roses. Hard to name another that bounces around as much as this and keeps making as many left turns. In this early section, we're also introduced to a pretty important image for the rest of the film, which is the taxi cab. Koichi is going to ride around in taxis a lot. Taxis are kind of interesting because on the one hand, they are anonymous people movers, just another piece of this big city, this infrastructure thing. When one taxi pulls away, another one immediately fills in behind it. But on the other hand, taxis have sort of a classic inflection. They're iconic, old world thing in a way. So maybe a little bit of tension here. I'm going to stop trying to shoehorn this movie into being Blade Runner, basically, because it doesn't quite fit, despite having a lot of kind of similar territory. This taxi is going to have a pretty weird role in the movie, though. In some ways, it reminds me a bit of the limousine in Holy Motors. And actually, I think there are some pretty deep similarities to that film and to the role of the cars in that film. I wouldn't actually be surprised if Leos Carax was a fan of this movie. There's an interesting shot later with a tunnel full of posters, the wall of this tunnel plastered with posters, which looks an awful lot like a scene in The Lovers on the Bridge. Not to say that he stole it. I just think he would like this movie given the kind of things he's made and given, yeah, I'm sure he's seen it. Anyway, the taxi is in part a sanctuary, but it also seems to facilitate teleportation, alienation. Koichi has some kind of relationship with the driver who's mainly a disembodied voice. There's some interesting plot developments that are really driven by the cab. Branded to Kill, I think, actually has a similar thing with cars, and Alphaville as well does some pretty fishy things with vehicles. Hey, cars are salient in this sort of city life, but yeah, very interesting role in this movie. There's some nice scenes with the taxi going through the tunnels here. Reminds me a lot of that sequence in Solaris. That, I think, maybe coincidence, but who knows? Anyway, it's interesting that we seem to bump into the same taxi again and again, despite, the city presumably being full of them. A city that's huge and sprawling, but also empty and desolate at the same time. The cab is supposed to be a brief note, not a huge tangent, so let's keep going. What I want to actually get to is one of the core elements of the film, which actually I should probably mention first that we get some really weird violence too in the beginning of the movie. Stuff that's even stranger than the things in the warehouses in the very beginning. Totally dismantled, totally taken apart, expressionist, over the top, really interesting. Anyway, what I wanted to get at is that before too long, we go to an underground noodle shop. Now, when I say underground noodle shop, I mean a shop that is literally subterranean, but also one that is legally subversive. It turns out that in the distant future, the late 90s, all midnight noodle stands have been outlawed. This is a bit of a curveball, to be honest. Like I said, weird movie. Why would the police be interested in food? Why would there be this panic about noodles? Why would they be the focal point of justice? Well, there's an interesting parallel being made here between food and drugs. And this is where we get to one of the biggest similarities between this movie and Branded to Kill. Branded to Kill is about a Yakuza guy who is hooked on the smell of freshly cooked rice, addicted to it like you would be addicted to a drug. Supposedly, a company that made rice cookers were sponsoring the film. That's the legend, at least. Anyway, some off-the-wall movies. Addicted to rice, underground noodle shops. These are very similar stories about the domestic being dramatic. When should the government or some other social or cultural mechanism intervene in the household? In some ways, this noodle panic isn't so different from things that have really happened. People worrying about kids playing violent video games. The Chicago Tylenol murders. Content ratings on films and television. Anti-loitering laws. Hopefully that doesn't seem like a random list of disconnected things. I think all of these are panicky things where there is some storyline about control over the domestic. I guess I'm using the term domestic pretty broadly here, but hopefully it makes sense. Now, the interesting thing about rice cookers and noodle stands is that they were once cornerstones of society to some degree. This isn't an insurgency like violent video games. People believed in noodle stands. I don't know if it's right to say that it was a traditional value exactly, but it was a staple, and now it's illegal. So is there some didactic thrust here? Were the old ways bad? Should noodles be illegal? Was it causing crime, right? Was this where, people were getting together to plan the downfall of society? Was it nefarious? Maybe the idea is the opposite. Maybe the idea is that it was silly to make noodles illegal. Maybe it's the new ways that are goofy. Or maybe the idea is that noodles really aren't that important, and people who are attached to them as if they are some key piece of society, maybe they're the ones who are being silly. Maybe they're the ones who are being nostalgic. Who cares if all-night noodles are shut down? It doesn't really matter, does it? Nostalgia. This is a very nostalgic film, it turns out, but it's a little bit unclear if nostalgia is a good thing or a bad thing. What is clear is that things are not going to be the same. Koichi bumps into people he knows on his return to the city, but he doesn't know them anymore. It's impossible for him to tell who he should trust and who he shouldn't. Should you trust nostalgia? Should you trust nostalgia? To be clear, I don't think there is exactly a didactic message in the noodle stands. Tearing down old beliefs and mourning the loss of old beliefs are kind of two sides of the same coin. If anything, the point is that the future has a profound ambivalence about the past. More importantly, this new city we're all going to be living in soon has reconfigured our lives, including things with an unexpected salience, like how we eat. When Koichi comes to this new city, the old justice, the certain justice of the Kerberos Brigade is totally gone, and nothing has really taken its place. Even the old comfort of the midnight noodle stand has eroded. The old comforts of his old friends have eroded. So hopefully this makes sense. I think this angle of the movie is actually somewhat straightforward, especially compared to some of the other things that are going to happen, but I'm not sure I've elucidated it very well. It's interesting, by the way, there doesn't seem to be much of an alternative to the noodles in the film. There isn't a lot of other food to eat at midnight. We've talked a little bit about Branded to Kill. What about the other movie, Alphaville? That, I think, also really defines this. And again, Alphaville is complicated, and I'm not going to get into it too much. But the one thing that I always remember about Alphaville is that it's set in the future. I forget exactly what year, but it's this sci-fi thing about a society where science and logic are really important to people and to government and such. Originally, the film was going to be called Tarzan versus IBM, apparently. It's always had a special significance to me because of that. This title, I think, didn't get past the legal team, unsurprisingly. Anyway, as you watch this movie, you think, for being a futuristic sci-fi film, this looks an awful lot like the present. They basically just went outside in Paris and found some brutalist buildings and some international-style buildings and called that the future. Your first instinct might be to think this is a shortcoming, to say, it's a low-budget film. This is the best that they could do. It's an intellectual film. The setting doesn't matter. Maybe if you're being more charitable, you might say that. And, budgets are a real thing, and the new wave is always at the intersection of low budget and true subversion. Interesting. But, this is Godard we're talking about. He is smarter than you and me. He knows it doesn't look like the future, and that's kind of the point. Alphaville is a movie that takes apart other science fiction movies, and one thing that's great about science fiction is that it's never really about the future. It's about the present. How could you make a movie about the future? After all, it hasn't happened yet. Okay, you can make a movie about what you think it might be like in the future, but you're going to find that when you do that, you're mainly talking about things that are happening right now. You're mainly extrapolating from things. You're mainly almost satirizing the foibles of the present, right? Science fiction, almost always about the present. I think the single best piece of advice you can give somebody who has never seen a Godard film or hasn't gotten into it exactly is that he's playful. He's a bit of a troll. And he's also purposeful in all these little tricks that he's constantly playing. So this playful futurism is a bit light, but it also has pretty poignant insights about film baked into it and about the world, our naive attempts to comprehend the future, right? And we have something pretty similar in the Red Spectacles, partly because we, again, have a bit of a rinky-dink future. But more generally, this is also just a really playful movie. That's pretty obvious in some of the style, which, as I've said, is just insanely off the wall. There's a couple of times where this movie comes to a screeching halt, and part of the story is told in pantomime, or we get a quick dance break, or, again, we go to a silent type thing. There's way more extreme sort of silent sequences, stuff like, looks like it could be a Three Stooges bit or something throughout this movie. Towards the end of the film, the movie basically self-destructs through self-reference, artifice, and just left turns. Maybe some of the themes of this movie are serious, and in a lot of ways it is a very serious movie, and it's an emotional movie, but it's also just such a fun movie to watch because it truly, that you have no chance of really predicting what's going to happen in The Red Spectacles. Anyway, it's one thing to have fun, but what should we actually make of all these twists? It's hard to generalize, honestly. But there is a moment towards the end of the movie that I really like. Koichi is standing out in the rain, facing up to his destiny, essentially. It's a big pivotal scene in the movie, but then we get a hard cut, and it turns out that he's actually in a shower. The rain is just coming from the faucet. So we get this switch between an existential, larger-than-life showdown to something domestic, mundane. Now, interestingly, Branded to Kill actually has the exact same pair of shots in it. It does the exact same thing with the guy standing out in the rain. Oh, he's in the shower. What's going on here? Well, maybe it is a story of battles under the skin, the huge dramas that we are all facing. Plenty of times I've been taking a shower and my mind has been elsewhere, facing up to some big conflicts in my life that feel huge, and that seeming to exist on a different plane than I live most of my life, that can't be controlled by logic or whatever. So maybe it's battles on their skin, or maybe it's kind of the opposite. Maybe it's skewering Koichi's inflated sense of self, making fun of the idea that he feels like he is some cinematic hero, when the reality is much more mundane. He has no face. He has no big showdown for his fate. Maybe it's a bit of a both, really, cluing us into the unstable relationship between our internal life and some larger cultural imagination, living in a world that is totally saturated by images, right? There's a phrase that has become relatively popular lately, being a main character. People say this to describe moments where they feel particularly in the moment, that they're the main character. They feel empowered. Or maybe they're just doing something cool. They feel cool. And it kind of makes sense, right? You feel like you are at the center of the world. Or you feel like someone should take a picture of you, put you in a movie. But when you think about it a bit more deeply, I think you realize that that is quite an odd thing to say. Feeling like a main character is when we feel the most alive, we feel the most real, but main characters are not real. They're contrived. They're fixtures in stories set up for consumption. What an interesting reversal, that the things that might seem the most vivid are actually the ones that are artificial and contrived. This movie is set in a future where the world is saturated by images. There are posters plastered all over the city with the faces of Midori and Soichiro on it. Koichi seems pulled almost by gravity back and back and back to this movie theater where he watches reels of his old friends. He's haunted by these images. A future where the world is saturated by images. That's today. And are we haunted? Or maybe it's a farce. Maybe it's ridiculous to be so shaken. Maybe it's ridiculous to think that those images are what you want, that you should be a main character, that people care about pictures of you, or that you should care about pictures of them. Maybe we just don't know how to feel about it, right? This unstable relationship between our internal lives and all these images. Big part of the movie, I think. And speaking of unstable, this movie basically destroys itself. We've all seen movies with ambiguous endings. This movie takes it to another level, truly, going down in a blaze of self-reference and artifice, taking so many left turns, it screws itself into the ground, a death spiral. Maybe this is our fate, to lose track entirely of the North Star, of reality, of truth, and just to be swept away in so many different images. Maybe some of them are real, but which ones? Maybe some of them matter, but which ones? And what a counterpoint this is to the uncontestable moral authority of the Kerberos Brigade when the world made sense. So that's the Red Spectacles. I've barely scratched the surface of what is one of the most interesting movies I have ever seen. Truly, one of the most interesting movies I have ever seen. What about the cat, right? What about all these literary quotations that sneak in? What about all these crazy stylistic techniques? What about the protect gear? What about the red spectacles? I didn't even talk about the red spectacles. Okay. You know, I got a life to live. Hopefully this is some interesting context, some kind of structure for what is a pretty darn abstract, off-the-wall movie. Like I said, it's a complete movie. It's fun to watch, even if it's like, doesn't make any sense what's going on. I just warn you not to expect it to be too much, well, not to expect it to be a normal movie at all, because the Red Spectacles is completely off the wall. But as long as you've got those expectations, you should absolutely check it out, because there's not a lot else like this besides the other movies I've identified that are very similar. But this is truly a special movie and one I can't recommend enough.